Hey guys, Mr. Davis here. So right now what I want to do is I want to do a video that's a little review of what we covered in chapter 4. I threw a lot of new terms at you over the course of this chapter, and I'm going to go through some of the most important of them, and I want to make sure that we are comfortable with it and that we understand what we've got to know for this chapter. All right, so let's get started, and we'll start by looking at the organization of an ecosystem. So first off, we want to talk about ecosystems, and they are defined as communities of organisms and their abiotic environment. So that is all the different organisms that live in an area and interact with each other, and the abiotic, the non-living factors of their environment, which could be the amount of water, the amount of sunlight, those kind of things. An example of an ecosystem could be an oak forest or maybe a coral reef. Now, these ecosystems, they of course border other ecosystems, and sometimes you have this kind of transitional zone between them, and it's not always like, oh, here's one, here's the next. It's not like they've got fences around them. So there's always a little bit of squishiness to there, but that's the general idea. Biotic factors then, which are the living things that are in an ecosystem, that's all of the organisms, plus their waste products and any dead organisms that you might have. So what's left over are the abiotic factors, and that includes things like rocks, air, water, the temperature, the amount of sunlight, those kind of things. So abiotic factors are environmental factors that are not and will never be and have never been alive. Okay? Now, the abiotic things can be used by living things, like you can drink water. That doesn't magically make the water come to life, okay? That just means that you are using that water in your biological processes, all right? So remember, the biotic factors are environmental factors associated with living things and are the result of their activities. Abiotic factors are the non-living things. All right, so then let's talk about the organization of a ecosystem. So you start out with organisms. That's things that are living and can carry out life processes on their own. Basically, they're able to breathe, eat, reproduce. All right. So this is everything from bacteria on up through humans. Everything. All right, plants, animals, all that stuff. Okay. One individual organism is the single one of one species. All right. So you're an organism, an ant, an ivy plant, and bacteria. All right, those are all individual organisms. Every organism is going to be defined as a member of a species, and species are groups of organisms that are closely related to one another. They can mate and produce fertile offspring. So, horses and donkeys are two different species. If they were to have an offspring, you get a mule, but a mule can't reproduce itself. So it is an infertile offspring. So that helps define horses and donkeys as two separate species. And then you have populations. So the populations are a group of organisms that are all the same species that live in a specific area, and they potentially interbreed with one another. Okay? So when we talk about a population, we're talking about all of the, striped trout in a pond. All right? That is a population, because those striped trout, they're going to stay in that pond. They're not going to go anywhere else. They're all going to just interbreed with the other striped trout in that pond. They're not going to interbreed with the, wide-mouthed bass in the pond. All right? That's what we're talking about when we say a population in ecology. And then you have communities. So the communities are the various species that live in the same habitat and interact with each other. So from my last example where I talked about, striped trout and, largemouth bass, well, they'd be part of the same community even though they're different species. So every population is going to be part of a community, and the most obvious difference between communities is the types of species they have. So in that pond, we've got the striped trout and the wide-mouthed bass, but if you go out in the ocean, you don't have those. It's a very different community. Or, hey, you come on land and you'll walk around out in the desert, you're not going to find a trout walking around with you, okay? Very different communities. All right, so land communities are often dominated by a few species of plants. Those plants then determine what other organisms can live in that community. If you've got nothing but tall trees with the branches way up high and you don't have any grasses or things like that on the ground, you're probably not going to have a lot of herbivores that move along the ground and graze on that. The picture that I have above me is a picture of the community of the African savanna. And you can see that you've got a combination of tall trees and those grasses down there. You've got that giraffe in the background, and he's going to be browsing on the tops of those trees. And then you got the zebra and I think those are wildebeest in the foreground, and they're going to browse on what's on the ground there. And the availability of those two food sources, the trees versus the grasses, kind of determines who lives where and eats what. So that is how communities are defined. They're also sometimes referred to as biomes, and we will talk about that in a later unit, where we're going to go through the different biomes and we'll discuss how those interact. All right, then you have a habitat. All right, so habitats are places where an organism usually lives. Is it going to live in a desert? Is it going to live in the ocean? Is it going to live in the forest? Where is it going to live? Every habitat has specific characteristics that organisms that live there are going to need. So if you've got a plant that's like a fern that you know, requires a lot of water, it's not going to grow well in a desert. All right. So most organisms tend to be well suited for the environment that they're in. On the other side, if you go to a forest where you get a lot of rain all the time and you try to plant a cactus there, it's going to get sick and die because there's too much water for it. So most animals and plants actually cannot survive long outside of their natural habitat, or at least a habitat that's very similar. So what might work is if you took a cactus from here in Arizona and you went over to, let's say, the Middle East, and there's areas there where a cactus would grow well because there's a low amount of moisture, rocky sand, and you know, clay-filled soils like we have here, so it might grow well. Or you take a you know, tree from the rainforest and in South America, and you go take that to Hawaii where they get a lot of rain and they've got rich soil. It might grow well there, like coffee. Yeah, coffee's grown in Hawaii. It's not from Hawaii originally. It grows well in South America. It's not from South America either. It's from Somalia in Africa. So yeah, that's how we can transplant plants, but we have to move them to other places that have a habitat very similar to where they come from. Same thing with animals. You can't take an animal from the tundra and transplant them to Arizona. All right, the tundra is like up in the ice and snow of the North Pole. You can't do that. It doesn't work. All right, you have to take them to somewhere where they can survive, where they can have a food source that's good for them, that they've got you know, temperature ranges and water availability that they need. Maybe you could take polar bears and transport them to the South Pole, but they'd probably completely destroy the penguin population. So they probably wouldn't last long there because they just eat up everything that they had. Maybe it would work, maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. I don't want to find out. I definitely don't want to introduce polar bears to the South Pole. But again, they might work because, again, similar habitats between the two. And that's the idea. All right, so if we have now, you know, talked about what makes a community, defined an individual, a population, those kind of things, let's talk about natural selection. And I want to just kind of cover this really quickly because we did a bunch of stuff on natural selection in class already. So individuals in a population vary with every generation. So each generation, individuals in a population are going to be slightly different. Some of these variations are genetic, and they're therefore inherited. All right. Most individuals that are produced live, grow up, and reproduce themselves. However, if an individual has certain genes that allow it to survive better or give it a better chance of survival, there is a greater chance that it will survive and reproduce. All right. If that organism reproduces, it will pass on those genes. If those genes convey a very clear benefit, then that gene will spread throughout the population over several generations, and eventually you will have an evolution of the population. The individuals don't evolve, populations do. So based on those principles, you have this possibility of organisms, or not organisms, of populations becoming well suited for their specific habitat, and that is natural selection. Those traits are selected for by nature, just virtue of the fact that they need these traits to survive. All right, so natural selection is then the process by which individuals that have favorable variations are better adapted to their environment, they survive and reproduce more successfully than less well-adapted individuals do. Evolution, then, is the change of characteristics of a population from one generation to the next based off of natural selection. So evolution is the change that occurs in a population as a result of long-term natural selection. And finally, adaptation is the process of becoming adapted to an environment. It is an anatomical, a physical, or behavioral change that improves a population's ability to survive. It is based off of, again, the odds of that organism surviving and reproducing being better than one that does not have that adaptation. And then lastly, if you have two species that interact together for a long time and they influence each other's adaptations, you can end up with something called coevolution. If you look above me, you can see that hummingbird there getting a drink from that bird of paradise flower. That flower has a shape that is very well adapted to help that hummingbird. It's got a little perch there the hummingbird can sit on. The depth of where the nectar is for that flower is the right depth for the hummingbird, and then the hummingbird is going to carry pollen from that flower to another flower of the same type, and they're both going to get to reproduce as a result of this. Eventually, the hummingbird will have offspring, and these bursts of energy that it gets from drinking the nectar from the flower is going to keep it surviving and then let it feed its young. Meanwhile, the flower is pollinating other flowers by having that hummingbird go from flower to flower to flower over and over again. So they're both ensuring each other's survival because they have co-evolved to have traits that the other one needs. All right. Then you got artificial selection, and man, that is a crazy looking dog up there. That's a Chinese crested. This dog has a number of interesting characteristics, and we're going to talk about that. So artificial selection is the selective breeding of organisms by humans for specific desirable characteristics. The Chinese crested dog is nearly hairless except for some hair on top of its head and around its little paws. The reason why it is nearly hairless is because this is a dog that was kept on ships where it had to move around in the depths of the ship. I'm talking like old sailing ships where it had to like dive into the bilge and be splashing around in salt water and gross, slimy, nasty things, because these were dogs that were kept as ratting dogs. So basically they hunted rats on ships that would eat food stores. Having no hair was a benefit there because then their hair wouldn't get tangled and matted, and they're less likely to have fleas and ticks and things like that if they have no hair. Or any fleas or ticks that they have can easily be just scratched right off, as opposed to a dog with hair where those fleas and ticks hang on to the hair. Dogs have been bred for certain characteristics. The downside to this is because those specific traits were chosen, it caused a couple of other problems. So you see how this dog has his tongue hanging out? It's because he doesn't have any bottom teeth. He doesn't have any teeth in its lower jaw. Because the side effect of messing with their genetics and selecting these traits on them, it actually has linked genes that link the hair growth to proper root growth of the teeth. It's recessive, but about 50% of these dogs, their teeth aren't set in completely and they fall out, and their tongue just kind of falls out as a result because their tongue's actually too big. You can see his eyes are not quite right. That's because of deformation of the occipital bones here. Again, those were traits that were selected for because people initially thought it was kind of cute to have this kind of squishy little face on it. But unfortunately, it's been over-selected for, and with inbreeding and things like that, that's what you get. And then lastly, we're going to talk about resistance, and that's the ability for an organism to tolerate a chemical or disease-causing agent. And this is, I'm grouping it kind of with artificial selection because Humans promote the evolution of resistant populations by trying to control pests and bacteria with chemicals. So guys, the second video that I'm going to post with this one on Google Classroom that you'll see is going to have a video that I want you to watch. It's going to be posted through Edpuzzle. So, you know, just watch it. That's all. Read the note at the end. But it's going to be on bacteria evolving resistance to antibiotics, and this is a big and growing problem in the pharmaceutical industry and in the medical industry, because as these bacteria evolve this resistance to antibiotics, that means that if you get an infection, we might not be able to treat it, and that's a really scary thought, because people get surgery and stuff like that. They need those antibiotics to survive. Okay, guys, very last thing that I'm going to show you. Boom! Classification of life on Earth. Here are couple different classifications of life. You start out with 3 domains, and then the domain Eukarya is divided into 4 kingdoms. So domain Archaea is the Archaea bacteria. They're extremophile bacteria that live in all sorts of crazy weird environments. They are things like methanogens that produce methane gas, or extreme thermophiles that live in hot springs, or halophiles which live in super salty briny water like Salt Lake or the Dead Sea. Then you have domain bacteria, which are unicellular again, so single-celled. They don't have a nuclei. They have things like cyanobacteria, which are blue-green algae. They're bacteria that grow in the ocean, and they produce a huge amount of oxygen. They're estimated that they may account for up to 1/3 or more of the oxygen on our planet just from these bacteria. 70% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. So, you know, a huge part of that is these bacteria living in the ocean. Then you have domain Eukarya, which is all life that has internal organelles inside its cells, so things like a nucleus, mitochondria, stuff like that. They can be unicellular or multicellular, although the only unicellular group in Eukarya is the kingdom Protista. They are unicellular. They live mostly in the water, and they include amoebas, trypanosomes, paramecium, stuff like that. And then you've got kingdoms Animalia and Fungia, which are consumers. Fungi are multicellular, but they have a cell wall made of chitin, usually, or something similar, or a similar protein, chitin or keratin. Those include yeast, mushrooms, mold, mildew, things like that. Then you have Animalia, which do not have a cell wall, and they're all multicellular. They include corals, sponges, basically any animal you can think of. All right, any animal you think of is Kingdom Animalia. And then lastly, we've got Kingdom Plantae, which is all the terrestrial plants. They make their own food with photosynthesis, and they have cell walls made of cellulose. All right, and that basically sums up the different forms of life on Earth. And yeah, that's pretty much chapter 4. So I'm going to have a video for you through Edpuzzle that I definitely want you to watch. It's going to be real short, but it's going to basically just show you a practical experiment that explains how this resistance of antibiotics by disease-causing bacteria happens. Then for our live session, we're going to do a little review. We'll do a live study guide that we'll all do together. And then next week on Tuesday, boom, that's going to be our chapter 4 test, and we'll go on with chapters 5 and 6, and we'll go from there. All right, guys, that's all I've got for you for now. You take care, have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.